Victoria Sterling sat in the corner of Riverside Coffee Shop, staring at a grocery store birthday cake with a single candle. The morning light through the window felt too bright, too cheerful for what this day had become. 40 years old. The number sat in her chest like a stone. 3 hours earlier, she had signed papers in the Sterling Tech boardroom, surrendering 49% of the company she had built from nothing. David Morrison had sat across the mahogany table, his smile sharp and satisfied. The board members had avoided her eyes. They called it a settlement. She called it theft dressed in legal language. Her phone buzzed against the table. Another text from her brother. She deleted it without reading. The pattern never changed. He asked for money. She sent it. He disappeared until the next crisis. Her sister had sent a birthday message through an assistant. Their mother was in Monaco with her fourth husband and couldn't be bothered to remember the date herself. The candle remained unlit. Victoria had bought the cake at the Jewel Osco 2 blocks from here because spending her 40th birthday completely alone felt like admitting defeat. But lighting the candle and making a wish felt worse. What would she even wish for the company back the trust she'd lost? The fiancé who'd sent a breakup email at 6 this morning, Thomas's message had been brief. Clinical even. Like he was canceling a meeting instead of ending a 4-year relationship. He and David were together now. She supposed she should have seen it coming. The late strategy sessions, the knowing glances. Her empire and her engagement had crumbled in the same 6 months, and she'd been too exhausted to notice until the wreckage buried her. The coffee shop smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon. Students hunched over laptops. A businessman argued into his phone. Life moved forward while Victoria sat frozen watching a single candle drip wax onto cheap frosting. A small voice cut through her numbness. The child appeared beside her table without warning. Dark curls framing a face too young to understand the weight of the question she asked. Her coat was clean but showed wear at the cuffs. Pink sneakers with scuffed toes. 7 years old, maybe. Eyes wide and honest in a way that made Victoria's throat tighten. The girl's father followed 2 steps behind, carrying a paper coffee cup like it was something precious. Tall, broad shoulders that came from physical work rather than gym memberships. Exhaustion lived in the lines around his eyes, the kind that sleep couldn't fix. Mid-30s, jeans worn soft at the knees, work boots that had seen actual work. He reached for his daughter's shoulder, gentle but urgent. An apology formed on his lips before he even opened his mouth. Victoria heard the embarrassment in how he held himself, shoulders slightly hunched, ready to retreat. A man used to being dismissed, but the child didn't move. She pointed at the cake with one small finger, tilting her head like she was solving a puzzle. Understanding spread across her face, followed by determination. Victoria's vision blurred. She blinked hard, surprised to find tears threatening. When had she last cried? Not at the board meeting. Not when she'd read Thomas's email. Not during the sleepless nights watching her company slip away. But this child's simple concern cracked something inside her that legal documents in betrayal couldn't touch. The words came out hoarse, unfamiliar in her own mouth. Admitting weakness to a stranger, to a child, should have felt humiliating. Instead, it felt like exhaling after holding her breath for months. The girl's face lit up with the kind of wisdom that children sometimes carry, delivered without guile or agenda. Just pure belief that wishes mattered, that birthdays should be celebrated, that no one should sit alone with an unlit candle. The father's hand tightened on his daughter's shoulder. Victoria saw him calculating distances, the gap between her Patek Philippe watch and his grocery store coffee, the designer handbag beside her chair versus his daughter's secondhand coat. He was measuring worlds, finding them incompatible, preparing to remove his child from a situation that made him uncomfortable. Something broke in Victoria then. Not her pride or her control, something deeper. The numbness cracked, and underneath it, she found she was drowning. Drowning in board meetings and betrayals and family members who only called when they needed something. Drowning in penthouse apartments that echoed with emptiness. Drowning in success that tasted like ashes. The father's discomfort deepened. He shifted his weight, preparing to apologize again and leave. To take his daughter back to their world where billionaires didn't sit alone with grocery store cakes. Victoria felt the moment slipping away. This small kindness, this unexpected gift of human concern, about to walk out the door because she'd built walls so high that even children's compassion couldn't scale them. She heard herself speak, heard the vulnerability in her voice that never made it into boardrooms or investor calls, heard herself tell the truth to strangers when her own family hadn't bothered to ask. The child considered this with a seriousness that seemed beyond her years, her face scrunched in concentration. Then pure joy replaced the worry as if she'd solved the most important problem in the world. Victoria's hands trembled as she looked at this small girl with her worn coat and bright smile. Friends. When had she last had a real friend? Business associates, certainly. Strategic relationships. People who wanted something from her or feared her power. But someone who simply wanted her company. Someone who saw her sadness and wanted to fix it. The father looked mortified. His face flushed with the particular shade of embarrassment that comes from having your child say exactly the right thing at exactly the wrong social moment. He started to gather his daughter to extract her from this encounter before it became more awkward. But Victoria shook her head. The movement felt strange, like her body was remembering how to express something other than rigid control. For the first time in hours and months, she felt something other than numbness crawl through her veins. Not quite hope. Not yet. But maybe the memory of what hope used to feel like. The child pulled out a chair before her father could stop her. The scrape of wood against tile was loud in the coffee shop quiet. She settled in like she'd been invited, like Victoria was someone worth knowing rather than someone to fear or use. The father remained standing frozen in that awful space between social obligation and self-preservation. Victoria saw him notice details, her cashmere sweater probably worth more than his month's rent. The Hermes bag, the kind with multi-year waiting list, the way other customers glanced at her with recognition or wariness. She watched him build the walls higher, watched him prepare to take his daughter and run from the billionaire who clearly lived in a different universe. The child started singing before anyone could object. Off-key and enthusiastic, filling the coffee shop with a birthday song that had no business being that joyful. Heads turned. A few customers smiled. The barista paused mid-pour to watch. The father's voice joined his daughter's, halfway through, reluctant at first, then warmer. Rough-edged and tired, but genuine. A contrast to his daughter's bright enthusiasm. Together they made the kind of imperfect harmony that only happens in real life, never in carefully orchestrated celebrations. When the song ended, the child clapped with pure delight. No awkwardness, no self-consciousness, just celebration for a stranger who needed it. Victoria kept her eyes closed longer than necessary, made a wish she didn't quite believe in, blew out the candle while the chemical smell of paraffin wax mixed with coffee and cinnamon. When she opened her eyes, the child was beaming. The father offered a small, uncertain smile. 2 hours passed like minutes. The child talked about school, about a drawing of a dragon she'd made that her teacher hung on the wall, about how her daddy promised hot chocolate if she behaved at the store, about her favorite constellation Orion because she liked his belt. Victoria found herself listening with an attention she never gave in board meetings. No multitasking, no checking her phone, no planning her next move. Just listening to a 7-year-old explain why purple was clearly the best color and why vegetables didn't count if you put cheese on them. The father tried several times to quiet his daughter, to apologize for her chattiness. But Victoria discovered she didn't mind. The child's voice filled empty spaces inside her that she hadn't known existed. Or maybe she'd known and chosen to ignore them because acknowledging emptiness meant admitting she'd built the wrong kind of life. She cut the cake with a plastic knife the barista had provided. 3 slices, 1 for each of them. When she handed a piece to the father, he hesitated. Pride warred with not wanting to disappoint his daughter. Victoria watched the internal battle play out across his face. His acceptance came with obvious reluctance. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. Offered genuine appreciation for grocery store cake that probably cost less than Victoria's morning coffee. They ate in silence for a moment, comfortable surprisingly. Victoria studied them, father and daughter, the way the child leaned into him when she laughed. How he automatically wiped frosting from her cheek with his thumb before she could protest. The intimacy of people who had only each other and had made that enough. Something in Victoria's chest ached. Not pain exactly, more like a muscle stretching after years of disuse. She'd built an empire but couldn't remember the last time someone had touched her with casual affection. Thomas's kisses had been scheduled around meetings. Her family's embraces came with price tags attached. The father asked a careful question, giving her room to deflect if she wanted, but his eyes held no judgment, just curiosity and maybe understanding. Like he knew what it felt like to carry weight alone. Victoria thought about the text messages piling up on her phone. Her brother needing $50,000 for another failed business venture. Her sister planning a third wedding and expecting Victoria to fund it. Her mother's assistant sending birthday wishes because her actual mother couldn't pause her Mediterranean vacation to dial a phone. The words came out flat, factual, but the child's face crumpled with genuine distress, like the concept of not having family around was the saddest thing she'd ever heard. The father said his daughter's name gently, a reminder about boundaries, about not prying into strangers' pain. But Victoria shook her head, found she was grateful for the child's honest reaction. Everyone else in her life had learned to hide their feelings behind polite masks. This little girl wore her heart openly, and Victoria had forgotten what that looked like. The child's declaration hung in the air, absolute and certain, like she'd just stated a fundamental law of the universe that adults had somehow forgotten. Something passed between Victoria and the father then, a flicker of recognition. She saw it in his eyes, that bone-deep weariness that came from caring too much for too long. The exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch because it lived deeper than the body. He understood. Somehow this stranger with his worn jeans and grocery store coffee understood what her wealthy friends and business associates never could. Maybe he saw the same thing in her. Behind the expensive watch and designer clothes, past the billionaire facade, down to the woman who'd bought her own birthday cake and sat alone because she had no one else. The moment stretched and broke. The father glanced at his phone, winced at the time, gathered their things with practiced efficiency. But when he announced their departure, there was reluctance in how he moved. Like leaving felt wrong, even though staying felt impossible. Victoria surprised herself. The invitation came from somewhere deep and desperate, a part of her that recognized this might be the last genuine human connection she'd have in weeks, months, maybe years. The father's discomfort returned sharper this time. His face did complex mathematics, weighing obligation against pride, his daughter's happiness against his own dignity. The gulf between their worlds yawned wide again. She was a woman who could buy the building they stood in without checking her bank balance. He was a man who counted coins for coffee. But the child's face blazed with hope, uncomplicated and pure. She wanted to see Victoria again, wanted to be birthday friends, wanted to believe that strangers who sang together in coffee shops could become something more. The father's jaw worked. Victoria saw the exact moment he surrendered, not to her wealth or status, to his daughter's joy, to the possibility that maybe this wouldn't hurt them, that maybe, just maybe, kindness could be simple again. One word, an agreement that felt like a promise. Victoria sat alone again after they left, but the coffee shop felt different now. Less empty. The remains of her birthday cake sat on the table, crumbs and melted candle wax, and she realized she was already counting days until Saturday. That night, Victoria stood in her penthouse, 42 floors above Lake Michigan. 3,000 square feet of marble and glass and emptiness. Art worth hundreds of thousands on the walls. Furniture that design magazines photographed. Views that made visitors gasp. And no one to share any of it with. She'd built sterling tech from nothing. At 25, she'd launched her first software solution with a $10,000 loan from a former boss who believed in her. Worked 100-hour weeks for 5 years straight. Became a millionaire at 30. The company had grown from her kitchen table operation to 1,500 employees across 3 states. Healthcare software that actually worked, that actually helped people. She'd been proud of that. Then she'd made David Morrison a partner. 3 years in, after he'd proven himself competent, strategic, trustworthy. They'd built the company together for 8 years. She'd introduced him to her fiancé at a company party. Thomas and David had become friends. She'd thought it was nice, her personal and professional lives meshing so well. She'd been an idiot. The betrayal had been meticulous. David had spent 2 years quietly moving assets, setting up shell companies, preparing for a hostile takeover. Thomas had known everything. Had helped probably. Had shared her bed while planning her downfall. The board had forced her to settle rather than fight. Bad publicity, they'd said. Better to give up 49% than risk losing everything in court. So she'd signed, smiled for the cameras, pretended it didn't gut her to surrender half of what she'd built. And now David Morrison owned 49% of Sterling Tech. Thomas was sleeping in David's bed, and Victoria stood alone in her beautiful empty penthouse wondering why success tasted like ashes. Her phone buzzed, another message from her brother. This one claimed emergency status. She deleted it like all the others. Tomorrow he'd call her heartless. Next week he'd try again with a different crisis. The pattern had held for 20 years. She'd stopped expecting it to change. Victoria looked at her phone's calendar app. 6 days until Saturday. She tapped in a reminder, coffee shop, 10 o'clock. Then she poured herself 2 fingers of scotch, Macallan 25, because if she was going to drink alone on her birthday, it might as well be expensive, and stood at the window watching the city glitter below. The week crawled. Victoria threw herself into damage control, trying to stabilize Sterling Tech, while David worked systematically to undermine her. Board meetings became battlegrounds. He questioned every decision, forced votes on minor issues, made her defend choices she'd have made without discussion 6 months ago. She came home each night, exhausted, and found Thomas's belongings still scattered through the penthouse. His toothbrush in the bathroom, his coffee mug in the cabinet, his absence louder than any argument. Thursday night, she finally boxed everything up, stuffed 4 years of shared life into cardboard and tape, left it all with the doorman with instructions to forward it to David's address. She didn't include a note. What would she say? Thanks for the betrayal, hope you're happy by Friday. Victoria had convinced herself they wouldn't come. The father and daughter, why would they? A billionaire and a single dad had nothing in common. She'd been a moment of charitable feeling for him, probably. His daughter had been kind and he'd played along. But surely he'd come to his senses, realized she lived in a different stratosphere. Decided to keep his daughter away from women who bought their own birthday cakes and sat alone in coffee shops, radiating desperation. Saturday morning arrived cold and bright. March in Chicago winter refusing to release its grip. Victoria dressed carefully, jeans instead of her usual tailored slacks, a sweater instead of a suit jacket. She wanted to look approachable, normal, like someone worth getting to know rather than someone to fear or use. She arrived at Riverside Coffee Shop at 9:55, ordered an Americano, sat at the same corner table and told herself she wasn't disappointed when 10 o'clock came and went. 10:15, 10:30. Of course they weren't coming. She'd been foolish to hope. Then the door opened. The child ran in first, face bright with excitement, spotted Victoria immediately and waved like they were old friends instead of people who'd shared a birthday cake once. The father followed, carrying shopping bags and looking harried, relieved when he saw Victoria, like he'd feared she wouldn't be there either. Relief crashed through Victoria so intensely it took her breath. They'd come. This was real. She hadn't imagined the connection or built it into something it wasn't. The father's apology came fast, genuine, explaining about broken down buses, about the unpredictability of Chicago's transit system. But Victoria barely heard the words. She was too busy processing the fact that he'd still come, that they'd waited in the cold for another bus rather than just go home, that this mattered to them too. The question slipped out without thought. Surprise colored it. She hadn't meant to sound amazed that someone might rely on public transportation. But the father's face shuddered slightly, embarrassment creeping in, a reminder that their worlds didn't align, that she probably spent more on car service in a month than he made in 3. The child intervened before awkwardness could settle, climbing into the chair beside Victoria with the ease of someone who'd never learned to fear powerful people, chattering about how they still came, how she told her daddy they had to, how friends didn't break promises. Warmth spread through Victoria's chest, foreign and welcome. When had someone last called her a friend without wanting something? When had someone's presence felt like a gift rather than an obligation or strategy? 2 hours passed. Victoria learned the father's name, Daniel Hayes. Learned he worked 3 part-time jobs because none offered full-time hours or benefits. Night janitor at an office building downtown, 11 at night until 7 in the morning. Weekend grocery stocker at the Jewel Osco, 2 blocks from his apartment, 6 to 10 on Saturday mornings. That explained their 10 o'clock arrival. He came straight from stocking shelves. And freelance bookkeeping during afternoons, working from home while his daughter did homework. $16 an hour for janitorial work, $15 for grocery, 30 to 50 for bookkeeping when he could find clients. No benefits, no paid time off, 52,000 a year gross if he was lucky, probably closer to 48 after taxes. Supporting himself and a daughter in Chicago on that amount. Victoria's watch cost more than his annual income. He'd lost his wife 5 years ago, cancer. Sophie had been 2 years old, barely old enough to remember her mother. Daniel had been working retail, then making 12 an hour. The medical bills had destroyed them. Collections agencies still called sometimes. He'd filed bankruptcy 3 years ago and was slowly building credit back. He explained all this without shame, but also without self-pity. Facts laid out plainly. This was his life. He worked hard, paid his bills when he could, provided for his daughter. What else was there? Sophie wanted to go to the beach for her birthday in July, 4 months away. She'd never seen the ocean. Daniel was saving $47 a week in a coffee can hidden in his closet. At that rate, he'd have enough for a weekend trip to Indiana Dunes by midsummer. 3-hour drive, cheap hotel, packed lunches. It would cost about $800 total, and it was the biggest thing he'd planned in 5 years. Victoria thought about her summer house in the Hamptons. Sat empty most of the year, worth $3.2 million. Property taxes alone cost more than Daniel's annual salary. She kept it because she could, because selling it felt like admitting defeat. But she hadn't visited in 3 years. Too busy building an empire to actually enjoy the spoils. The contrast made her physically sick. Daniel asked about her work. Victoria deflected, keeping details vague. She ran a tech company, software solutions for healthcare. Just went through a difficult business situation. Nothing specific. Nothing that would make him Google her later and realize exactly how wide the gap between them really was. But she told him about her family, the truth of it. Brother who only called for money. Sister planning her 3rd wedding on Victoria's dime. Mother whose assistant sent birthday wishes because the actual parent couldn't be bothered. 20 years of being treated like an ATM by people who shared her DNA. Daniel listened without judgment. Didn't offer platitudes or try to fix anything. Just listened with the kind of attention that made her feel heard. Actually heard. Not for her money or connections or what she could do for someone. Just heard. Sophie asked questions with a 7-year-old's brutal honesty. Why didn't Victoria's family love her? Did she do something wrong? Was she sad a lot? Daniel tried to quiet his daughter, embarrassed by the directness. But Victoria found she didn't mind. The child's concern felt genuine in a way adult sympathy never did. When Victoria admitted she didn't really have family, Sophie's face crumpled, declared with absolute certainty that everyone should have family. Daniel said his daughter's name, gently a reminder about boundaries. But Victoria shook her head, found herself grateful for the child's fierce protectiveness of a stranger. Something passed between Victoria and Daniel again. Longer this time. Deeper. She saw him really look at her, past the expensive clothes and obvious wealth, down to the loneliness that mirrored his own, the bone-deep weariness of carrying too much alone for too long. Maybe he saw her recognize the same thing in him, the exhaustion that lived beneath his skin, not just from 3 jobs and single parenthood, from something more fundamental, the weight of responsibility, of having no backup, of knowing that if he failed, his daughter paid the price. Time slipped away faster than Victoria wanted. When Daniel finally stood to leave, collecting Sophie's coloring book and his empty coffee cup, Victoria felt panic flutter in her chest. This connection, tenuous as it was, felt precious, rare, real in a way nothing in her life had been for years. The invitation came out too fast, too eager. Not smooth or controlled, just desperate and honest. She wanted to see them again. Wanted more of this, whatever this was. Wanted to not go back to her empty penthouse and pretend she was satisfied with success measured in bank accounts. Daniel nodded slowly, relief and uncertainty mixing on his face. Like he wanted this too, but couldn't quite believe it was being offered. Like he was afraid to hope it might be real. Sophie beamed, grabbed Victoria's hand with sticky fingers that probably had traces of hot chocolate on them, announced they could be birthday friends like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like billionaires and working-class families became friends all the time, and there was nothing complicated about it. They left together, father and daughter waiting at the bus stop, visible through the coffee shop window. Sophie waved back at Victoria with wild enthusiasm. Daniel lifted his hand in a smaller gesture, Then the bus arrived and swallowed them, taking them back to their neighborhood while Victoria remained in hers. But something had shifted. The coffee shop didn't feel empty anymore. And Victoria realized she was already counting the days until next Saturday. The following Friday night, Victoria made a decision she didn't examine too closely. Called her personal mechanic, a man she'd used for years, trusted to be discreet. Gave him an address on the south side. Told him there was a 1998 Honda Civic with transmission problems. Told him to fix it and send her the bill. Told him not to mention her name. She told herself it was practical. Daniel had mentioned the car problems. Said he was watching YouTube videos trying to learn repairs, but didn't have the right tools. The car was essential. He needed it to get Sophie to school, to drive to his bookkeeping clients' offices to buy groceries. A broken transmission could destroy what little stability he'd built. She didn't think about how he'd react. Didn't consider the pride of a man who worked 3 jobs to avoid charity. Didn't wonder if maybe this crossed a line. She just saw a problem she could fix with one phone call and a credit card that had no limit. So she fixed it. Monday afternoon, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something made her pick up. Daniel's voice came through tight and controlled. The kind of careful tone people use when they were barely holding back anger. Asking if she'd sent someone to fix his car. And Victoria realized with sudden, sickening clarity that she'd made a terrible mistake. She tried to explain. Thought it would help. He'd mentioned needing tools and she just wanted to make things easier. The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Excuses wrapped in good intentions. His response cut through her explanations, sharp and harder than he probably intended. But underneath the anger, she heard something else. Hurt. Like she'd confirmed every fear he'd had about the gap between their worlds. Like she'd proved that rich people would always see poor people as problems to be solved rather than equals to be respected. He told her he'd looked her up, found articles about Sterling Tech, about the 9-figure acquisition offers she'd turned down, about her net worth estimated at $1.2 billion, found the photos of her at charity galas in gowns that cost more than his rent, read about the penthouse, the summer homes, the wine collection valued in 7 figures. And then he'd pointed out the obvious. She was a billionaire. He was some guy who took the bus with his kid. What was she doing spending time with them? The question landed like a blow. Victoria heard the assumption underneath it, that she was slumming, that this was curiosity or pity or boredom, that people like her didn't genuinely connect with people like him, that there had to be an angle, a reason, something transactional underneath the friendship she thought they were building. Her response came out sharper than intended, defensive, but also true. Daniel and Sophie were the first real people she'd met in years. Everyone else wanted something or feared something or calculated angles. But they'd just seen a sad woman on her birthday and offered kindness. No agenda, no expectations, just human decency. The line went quiet, long enough that Victoria wondered if he'd hung up. Then his voice came back softer but still firm, explaining something she should have understood from the beginning. That he needed to be able to provide for his daughter himself. That it wasn't just pride, it was identity. It was proof that he was enough, that he could take care of his child, that he wasn't a failure, even if he wasn't rich. Understanding crashed through Victoria. She'd stripped that from him. Taken away his agency with one thoughtless phone call. Proved that his hard work and sacrifice didn't matter because she could fix his problems with money he'd never have. She'd humiliated him without even realizing it. Her apology came genuine and immediate. She hadn't thought about how it would make him feel. She'd just seen a problem and solved it the way she solved everything, throw money at it until it went away. She'd forgotten that not every problem should be solved that way. That sometimes people needed to struggle because the struggle proved something important about who they were. He told her he'd pay her back, however long it took, $50 a week if that's what he could manage. She tried to tell him he didn't have to, but he cut her off, said he did have to, said it mattered. And Victoria heard in his voice that if she didn't let him pay her back, they were done. This fragile friendship would shatter because she'd taken something from him he couldn't afford to lose. So she agreed, told him to pay her back, knew she'd never cash the checks, but understood he needed to write them. They hung up. Victoria sat in her office, surrounded by the trappings of success, and felt more alone than she had in weeks. She'd finally found real people, genuine connection, something that mattered more than quarterly earnings, and she destroyed it with a phone call and a credit card. That night, Daniel sat in his apartment after Sophie went to bed, stared at his phone, at the number for Sterling Tech's main line. He'd found it easily, Victoria. Sterling wasn't hard to Google. Co-founder and CEO, net worth estimated at $1.2 billion, featured in Forbes, Fortune, Bloomberg. Photos of her at industry conferences, charity events, gala dinners. Always perfectly composed, always in control, and he'd snapped at her. Let his pride and insecurity turn a gesture of kindness into an insult. She'd tried to help, and he'd made her feel terrible about it, because he was too stubborn to accept that maybe, just maybe, someone wanted to do something nice without expecting anything in return. Sophie had heard him on the phone, heard the anger in his voice, asked why he was mad at Victoria. Daniel had tried to explain that grown-ups sometimes had complicated feelings about accepting help, that it was about pride and self-respect. Sophie had looked at him with 7-year-old wisdom and said he should apologize, that friends forgave each other. His daughter was right, as usual. Saturday morning arrived heavy with uncertainty. Daniel almost didn't go, almost kept Sophie home and let this thing die before it got more complicated. But Sophie insisted, reminded him they'd promised. Told him friends didn't break promises just because things got hard. So he went. Arrived at the coffee shop at 10:15 late because he'd hesitated too long. Half expected Victoria not to be there. Why would she be? He'd yelled at her for trying to be kind, made her feel bad about having money, proved every assumption she probably had about working-class people being too proud to accept help. But she was there at the same corner table, looking up when they walked in with an expression that matched his own relief mixed with uncertainty, like she'd been afraid they wouldn't come. Like this mattered to her too. Daniel's apology came immediately, the words he'd been rehearsing all week, explaining that his reaction hadn't been fair, that she was trying to be kind and he'd made it about his own insecurities, that he was sorry. Victoria shook her head, stopped him mid-sentence, her own apology rushing out, admitting she'd overstepped, admitting she didn't know how to have normal friendships, admitting something deeper, that everyone in her life there was always a transaction, always an expectation, always a price tag attached to every interaction. Then she told him something he hadn't known, something not in the Forbes articles or Bloomberg profiles, that she'd grown up poor. Southside Chicago, not far from where he lived now, food stamps and government cheese and thrift store clothes. She'd built everything from nothing, and somewhere along the way she'd forgotten how to connect with people without using money. Daniel stared at her, processed this information that shifted everything he'd assumed. She wasn't some trust fund kid who'd never struggled. She'd climbed out of poverty, built a billion-dollar company, and then found herself isolated by the very success she'd fought so hard to achieve. He told her something true then, something he hadn't admitted even to himself, that she was the first person in a long time who made him feel like maybe he wasn't drowning. That every conversation didn't have to be about survival, that life could include moments of genuine joy instead of just grinding through another day. But when she tried to fix things with money, it reminded him of everything he couldn't give Sophie. Every toy he couldn't afford, every experience he couldn't provide, every opportunity his daughter missed because they were poor. It wasn't about pride, not really. It was about fear. Fear that he wasn't enough. Fear that Sophie would grow up and realize her father was a failure. Fear that loving someone rich would only highlight everything he lacked. Victoria understood. He saw it in her eyes. She carried the same fear that she wasn't enough, that without her money and power and success, there was nothing of value underneath, that people would abandon her if she couldn't offer them anything tangible. Sophie looked between them, sensing the tension, asked in a small voice if they were fighting, if they weren't friends anymore. The question carried weight beyond its simplicity. This mattered to her, this connection between her father and this kind woman who'd let them share her birthday cake. Daniel knelt to his daughter's level, told her gently that they weren't fighting, just figuring things out, learning how to be friends when their lives looked so different, promising it would be okay. Victoria promised too, no more trying to fix things with money, no more crossing boundaries, just friendship, plain and simple and real. They sat together and talked for 3 hours, longer than any previous Saturday. Daniel told her about Rebecca, his wife. Met her at community college where they were both working full-time and taking night classes. Got married at the courthouse in a $50 dress because they couldn't afford anything else. Sophie was born 3 years later, and Rebecca called her their miracle. The cancer diagnosis came when Sophie was 18 months old. Breast cancer stage 3. No insurance because Daniel was working retail, and Rebecca was teaching at a private preschool that didn't offer benefits. The bills piled up faster than the treatments. Surgery, chemo, radiation. They'd lost everything. Their tiny savings, their car, their apartment. Moved in with Rebecca's parents. Watched her deteriorate while Daniel worked double shifts trying to pay for treatments that weren't working. Rebecca died 2 weeks after Sophie's second birthday. Told Daniel with her last conscious words to take care of their girl, to make sure Sophie knew she was loved. Daniel had kept that promise every single day for 5 years. Victoria listened with tears in her eyes, told him about building her first company at 25, working 100-hour weeks for 5 years straight, sleeping 4 hours a night, living on ramen and coffee, becoming a millionaire by 30 through sheer stubborn refusal to fail, meeting David Morris at a tech conference, thinking she had finally found a partner she could trust, making him co-founder after 3 years of working together, believing in loyalty and partnership and shared vision, then finding the text messages on Thomas's phone, her fiancé and her business partner. Together, plotting. She'd spent 4 years with Thomas, introduced him to David, thought she'd built something solid in both her professional and personal life. Instead, she'd built a house of cards that collapsed the moment she stopped watching. The board had forced her to settle, give David 49% rather than fight a public battle that would tank the stock price. She'd signed the papers and felt like she was signing away part of herself, half of what she'd built, half of her life's work, gone because she'd trusted the wrong people. Daniel reached across the table without thinking, took her hand, squeezed once, a gesture of comfort that cost nothing and meant everything. They discovered something then. Sitting in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning while Sophie colored pictures of dragons and unicorns. They discovered they had more in common than economics would suggest. Both workaholics covering pain, both exhausted from carrying weight alone, both starving for genuine connection in a world that seemed designed to keep people isolated. The conversation turned lighter as the morning stretched. Sophie asked Victoria if she had kids. Victoria admitted she didn't, that she'd always thought she would, but spent so many years building her business that she never made time. That now she was 40 and alone and wondering if she'd made the wrong choices. Sophie frowned, considered this with a child's earnest gravity, then announced with absolute certainty that Victoria wasn't alone. She had them. Victoria's eyes burned. She blinked rapidly, trying to maintain composure. But Daniel saw the moment something inside her cracked open. Saw her realize that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to build a different kind of life. One that included people instead of just profits. He found himself watching her differently then, not as a curiosity or a charity case or a complicated situation to navigate, but as a woman, a person, someone kind and lonely and brave enough to admit she didn't have all the answers despite having all the money. Something was happening, something neither of them planned or expected, something that terrified Daniel because he knew how these stories ended. Rich people got bored of poor people. The novelty wore off. Reality intruded. Worlds that looked compatible over coffee proved incompatible everywhere else. But for now, in this moment, it felt possible. So he suggested they walk. They left the coffee shop together, Sophie running ahead to look at dogs and store windows. Daniel and Victoria walked side by side along the Chicago Riverwalk, spring trying to push through winter's stubbornness, clouds breaking apart to reveal blue sky, the city waking up around them. Daniel asked the question that had been eating at him all week, why she'd come back. After he'd yelled at her, made her feel terrible, proved every assumption about class conflict, she could have walked away, should have walked away, spent her Saturdays somewhere more comfortable with people who didn't make things complicated. Victoria stopped walking, turned to face him, told him the truth she hadn't wanted to lose him. That he and Sophie made her feel like herself again. Not the CEO or the billionaire or the woman in Forbes magazine, just Victoria, a person who could laugh and relax and exist without calculating angles or maintaining images. Daniel stood very still, aware of people passing them on the riverwalk, aware of Sophie 20 yards ahead pointing at a dog, aware of his heartbeat accelerating because this woman, this impossibly wealthy, impossibly beautiful woman, was telling him she needed him. Not his money or his connections or what he could do for her. Just him. He told her he hadn't wanted to lose her either. Told her honestly without pretense, letting her see past his own defenses. Admitting that Saturday mornings had become the brightest part of his week. That he looked forward to their conversations more than he'd looked forward to anything in 5 years. They started walking again. But everything had shifted. Both of them knew it. Neither quite ready to name it yet. But the air between them felt charged with possibility. Daniel spoke carefully, explained something she needed to understand before this went further. That he couldn't give her the life she was used to. No expensive dinners because he couldn't afford $50 entrees. No trips to Europe because he'd never left Illinois. No gifts because his budget didn't include discretionary spending. Victoria stepped closer, near enough that he could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive that probably cost more than his weekly grocery budget, told him she didn't want those things from him, that she had money. What she didn't have was someone who saw her, who asked how she was doing and actually cared about the answer. Daniel met her eyes, told her simply and honestly that he saw her, had seen her since that first day with the birthday cake and the unbearable sadness, saw past the wealth and power to the woman underneath who was just as lost as he was. Sophie called out from ahead, complained they were walking too slow. The moment broke but didn't disappear. It hung between them as they caught up to his daughter, hung between them as they spent the afternoon together, hung between them when they finally said goodbye, and Daniel watched Victoria walk to her car, a Mercedes S-Class that cost more than he'd make in a decade. He drove home in his newly repaired Honda Sophie, chattering in the back seat, pulled into his parking spot next to the dumpster that always overflowed by Friday, climbed 3 flights because the elevator was still broken, unlocked the door to his 600-square-foot apartment with the water stain on the ceiling and the radiator that clanked at night. His life looked exactly the same as it had a month ago. Same apartment, same ground, same struggles. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time since Rebecca died, Daniel let himself imagine a future that included more than just survival. Let himself hope that maybe despite everything, happiness was still possible. He didn't know how it would work. Couldn't imagine Victoria Sterling fitting into his world any more than he could imagine fitting into hers. But Sophie had fallen asleep, hugging the drawing she'd made at the coffee shop, 3 stick figures holding hands. And Daniel realized his daughter had already figured out what he was afraid to believe. Some things mattered more than money. Some connections transcended circumstance. And sometimes the bravest thing you could do was admit you needed someone. He set Sophie's drawing on the refrigerator next to the past due electric bill and the collection letter from the hospital. Contrasts. His life was full of contrasts now. But for the first time in 5 years, those contrasts didn't feel like failures. They felt like possibilities. The photograph appeared online on a Sunday evening. Victoria was reviewing quarterly reports when her phone started buzzing with notifications. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all exploding simultaneously. Someone had captured them at Lincoln Park Zoo, her carrying Sophie on her shoulders, Daniel kissing her cheek, all 3 of them laughing like an actual family. Within 2 hours, the image had been shared 17,000 times. The comment section became a battlefield. Half the internet called Daniel a gold digger, the other half called Victoria desperate. Everyone had opinions about what a billionaire CEO should do with her personal life. The headlines wrote themselves. Business magazines questioned her judgment. Gossip sites speculated about midlife crises. Financial blogs analyzed how her romantic choices might affect Sterling Tech's stock price. Someone dug up Daniel's bankruptcy filing from 3 years ago. Someone else found photos of Victoria at last year's Met Gala in a gown that cost $40,000. The contrast made excellent clickbait. Victoria's phone rang at 11 that night, her PR director voice tight with barely controlled panic. They needed to do damage control immediately. The board was already receiving calls from nervous investors. Major clients were scheduling emergency meetings. David Morrison was filing motions questioning her fitness to lead the company. She spent Monday morning on conference calls. Her legal team outlined worst-case scenarios. Her PR team drafted statements that said nothing while sounding apologetic. Her board chairman scheduled an emergency meeting for Tuesday. Everyone wanted her to fix this, make it go away, prove she was still the ruthless businesswoman who built a billion-dollar empire and not some lonely fool who'd fallen for the first kind face she'd encountered. No one asked if she was okay. No one wondered if the relationship might be genuine. They just calculated risk and demanded she minimize exposure. Daniel called Monday afternoon. His voice sounded hollow, scraped raw by something beyond exhaustion. He'd seen the news, seen the comments, seen strangers dissecting his life and finding him wanting. Victoria tried to apologize. Tried to say she'd fix this, make them stop, protect him from the feeding frenzy. But Daniel cut through her promises with a truth that made her chest ache. They weren't wrong. He was poor. He was struggling. And being with him was destroying her reputation. She insisted she didn't care about her reputation, but even as the words left her mouth, her other line buzzed. Board chairman, legal counsel, major client CEO, all wanting to discuss her recent behavior, all questioning whether she was stable enough to lead Sterling Tech through this crisis. Then Daniel told her about Sophie. Some kid at school had shown his daughter the comments. 7 years old, and she'd had to ask her father what a gold digger meant. Had to hear him explain that people thought he was only with Victoria for money. Had to watch her father's face crumble as he tried to make sense of cruelty she was too young to understand. Victoria's tears came hot and fast. She'd brought this into their lives. Her wealth, her visibility, her inability to have anything private. She'd taken a good man and a sweet child and exposed them to viciousness they'd never asked for. Daniel's voice cracked when he spoke again. Asked if maybe he was just dragging her down. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe love wasn't enough to bridge the gap between their worlds. Maybe he should step back before Sophie got hurt worse. She begged him not to give up, swore they could survive this. But her conviction felt thin against the weight of public opinion and board pressure and the very real possibility that choosing him meant losing everything she'd built. They hung up without resolution. Victoria sat alone in her office and felt walls closing in. Tomorrow she had to face the board. Tomorrow she had to choose between the company she'd spent 20 years building and a man she'd known 4 months. Logic said the choice was obvious. Her heart said logic could go to hell. Tuesday morning arrived with a news alert that made Victoria's blood run cold. Video footage shot on someone's phone, shaky and grainy but clear enough. Reporters swarming Daniel's apartment building, ambushing him as he returned from his night shift. Exhausted, wearing his janitor uniform, clearly unprepared for the assault of microphones and questions. They asked about his relationship with Victoria Sterling. He looked overwhelmed, trapped, desperately trying to be polite while escaping. Called her a good person, one of the best he'd ever met. But then a reporter asked directly if he knew people were calling him a gold digger. Daniel had flinched, visible hurt crossing his face before he could hide it. Admitted he was aware of the accusations. And when they pressed, asked what he had to say to those who thought he was using her, Daniel made a decision that broke Victoria's heart. His words came out careful and defeated. Told the cameras that Victoria didn't need someone like him complicating her life, that he was stepping back. Begged them to leave her alone. Begged them to leave his daughter alone. The video ended. Victoria played it 3 times, watching Daniel sacrifice himself to protect her. Watching him choose her reputation over their relationship. Watching him prove every cynical assumption wrong by walking away when staying would have been easier and more profitable. She'd never loved him more, and she'd never felt more helpless. The emergency board meeting started at 9. Victoria walked into the conference room to find every member present. David sat at the far end wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He'd orchestrated this, used her vulnerability to push for the full takeover he'd always wanted. The chairman opened with carefully neutral language. Several major investors had expressed concerns about recent developments. They wanted reassurance about stability, about focus, about whether Victoria was capable of leading Sterling Tech through turbulent times. David leaned forward, dropping all pretense of sympathy. She just lost half the company because she couldn't see betrayal coming. Now she was making headlines dating someone completely inappropriate. The optics were terrible. Investors were questioning her judgment. Clients were threatening to leave. Victoria kept her voice level, pushing back against the characterization. Her personal life wasn't board business. She'd run the company successfully for 15 years. One relationship didn't negate a decade and a half of results, but another board member chimed in more sympathetic but equally concerned. They weren't attacking her personally, but surely she could see how this looked. A billionaire CEO dating a janitor right after losing half her company. It suggested instability, poor decision-making, emotional volatility that didn't inspire confidence. David pressed harder. Cut the janitor loose. Refocus on the company. Prove she could still lead, or they'd have to consider other options. The threat hung in the air, sharp and clear. They would vote her out if she didn't comply. Victoria looked around the table, calculated which members might support her and which would side with David. Did the math and didn't like the answer. She needed time to shore up alliances to prove her leadership wasn't compromised, to find a way to keep both her company and her personal life. The chairman gave her until Wednesday morning, 24 hours to decide whether Sterling Tech or Daniel Hayes mattered more. They'd vote at 9 o'clock. Be ready. Victoria left the boardroom feeling like she was drowning. Spent Tuesday afternoon in her office with the door closed and her phone turned off. Stared at the city sprawling below her window. Tried to imagine life without Sterling Tech, without the company she'd built from nothing, without the identity she'd wrapped around herself for 20 years. But every time she pictured walking away, she saw Daniel's face, saw Sophie's drawing on her refrigerator, saw Saturday mornings that had saved her when she didn't even know she needed saving, saw a future that included love and family and something more valuable than quarterly earnings. At midnight, Victoria made a decision, called Marcus Chen, the private investigator she'd used for sensitive matters before. Former FBI specialized in white-collar crime. If anyone could find dirt on David Morrison, Marcus could. She told him what she needed. Everything on David. Bank accounts, shell companies, mistresses, parking tickets. Every dollar he'd moved in the last 8 years. Every lie he'd told. Every corner he'd cut. She needed proof that his betrayal went deeper than just maneuvering her out. Needed evidence that would destroy him before he destroyed her. Marcus warned her it would take weeks, maybe months. She told him he had 36 hours, would pay triple his rate, quadruple if he delivered what she needed. Then she sat in her dark office and let herself imagine that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to choose between love and success. Maybe she could fight for both. Maybe being ruthless in business didn't mean being ruthless with her heart. Wednesday morning came too fast. Victoria arrived at her office at 6, knowing she couldn't face the board meeting without some kind of plan. Found an email from Marcus, waiting, preliminary findings, promising leads, but nothing solid enough to present yet. He needed more time. Time she didn't have. At 8:15, her assistant buzzed. Someone here to see her. A child. Claiming it was urgent. Victoria's heart stopped. She ran to the reception area, found Sophie standing there looking small and frightened and impossibly brave. The girl had taken the bus, alone, all the way from the south side to downtown. Remembered the address from when they'd driven past Victoria's building once. A 7-year-old navigating Chicago's public transit because she thought she could fix what adults had broken. Victoria knelt down, heart hammering, asked where Daniel was, whether he knew Sophie was here. The child shook her head. She'd left for school but came here instead. Because her daddy wouldn't stop crying last night. Because people were saying he wasn't good enough. Because Victoria made them happy and Sophie didn't want to lose that. The girl's face crumpled. Explained through tears that her daddy had already lost her mommy. She didn't want him to lose Victoria too. Didn't want to go back to the way things were before, when her father smiled less and worked more and looked so tired all the time. Victoria pulled Sophie into a fierce hug, made a promise she didn't know if she could keep, told this brave, terrified child that she wasn't leaving, that she loved Sophie's father. That family mattered more than board meetings and investor confidence, and everything else the world said should come first. Then she called Daniel, told him immediately that Sophie was safe, with her, had taken the bus to the office. Daniel made a choked sound of pure panic. Started asking how that was possible. What had his daughter been thinking? Was she okay? Victoria cut through his terror, told him to come to her office. They needed to talk, really talk, about what happened next, about whether they were going to keep letting fear make their decisions. Daniel arrived 40 minutes later. Face pale, jaw tight, looking like a man barely holding himself together. He grabbed Sophie the moment he saw her. Held her so tight Victoria worried about the child's ribs, told his daughter in a voice raw with emotion that she could never do something like that again, that she'd scared him to death. Sophie apologized through tears, said she just wanted to help, wanted to fix things. Because that's what families did, they helped each other. Daniel closed his eyes, took a shaking breath, then looked at Victoria over his daughter's head with an expression that held too much pain. After Sophie was settled in the reception area with Victoria's assistant, who'd been briefed to call the school and explain the situation, Daniel and Victoria stood alone in her office. The city sprawled below them. 9 o'clock approached. The board meeting loomed. Everything hung in the balance. Daniel spoke first. Said he couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't watch his daughter take buses across the city because she could see how much this was hurting everyone. Couldn't let Victoria lose everything she'd worked for because of him. It wasn't fair to her, it wasn't fair to Sophie. Victoria stepped close, took his hands, told him with steel in her voice that he wasn't the one making her lose anything. The board was. David was. The system that said a woman couldn't have both professional success and personal happiness without sacrificing one to prove the other. She was done letting fear control her life. Done playing by rules designed to keep her isolated and controllable. She'd spent 20 years building what they wanted, becoming who they expected, and it had made her miserable. Alone, empty. Daniel pulled her into his arms, buried his face in her hair, admitted he was terrified of losing her, of hurting Sophie, of failing at the one thing that mattered more than survival. They stood together while Manhattan bustled 42 floors below, holding each other, gathering strength for what came next. The board meeting was in 15 minutes. Victoria had to walk into that room and make a choice that would define the rest of her life. But then Daniel pulled back, looked at her with something new in his eyes, a determination replacing despair. Told her he was done running, done being passive, done letting circumstances control them. He'd been thinking about something for weeks, something that had bothered him since she first mentioned David pushing her out. The phrase she'd used, moved assets quietly. It had stuck in his mind, nagging at him during late-night bookkeeping sessions. Daniel walked to her desk, pulled a folder from his messenger bag, explained that 3 weeks ago he'd looked into Sterling Tech's public filings, SEC documents, annual reports, quarterly statements. He'd cross-referenced expense reports and found a pattern that made his accountant instincts scream. Consulting fees to 3 shell companies, Morrison Strategic Solutions, Tech Advisory Partners, Innovation Catalyst Group, all incorporated in Delaware, all registered to the same address, all owned by David Morrison through layers of legal fiction. Payments always just under $50,000, the threshold requiring board approval, adding up to $2.7 million drained over 2 years. Victoria's hands shook as she took the folder, stared at spreadsheets covered in Daniel's careful highlighting, bank records, company registrations, payment schedules, a timeline of systematic theft laid out in black and white. This wasn't just maneuvering. This was embezzlement, securities fraud, criminal activity that could send David to prison for 20 years. And Daniel, her janitor boyfriend, that the world dismissed as a charity case, had uncovered what her lawyers and accountants had missed. She looked at him with new eyes, asked why he hadn't told her before, why he'd sat on evidence that could have saved her company weeks ago. Daniel's answer came quiet but honest. He hadn't been sure at first, needed to verify the connections, didn't want to give her false hope, but also, and his voice dropped lower, here he'd wanted to do something for her. Something real. Something that proved his worth came from more than just good intentions. Victoria felt tears burn behind her eyes. This man had worked late into the night after grueling shifts, had used skills learned from necessity to fight battles that weren't his to fight, had given her a weapon against enemies who dismissed him as irrelevant. She grabbed her phone, called Marcus Chen, sent him photos of Daniel's documentation, told him to corroborate everything and send it to the board immediately. They had 40 minutes before the meeting started. Get it done. Then she turned back to Daniel, told him to come with her to the board meeting. She wanted them to see exactly who he was, wanted them to understand that the man they'd dismissed had just handed her the keys to destroying David Morrison. Daniel hesitated, pointed out he wasn't dressed for a board meeting, wore jeans and a flannel shirt because he'd rushed over in a panic about his daughter, Looked like exactly what he was, a working-class father with no business in corporate boardrooms. Victoria smiled, a sharp, dangerous smile that had nothing to do with kindness. Told him he was dressed perfectly. Let them see the man they'd underestimated. Let them face the fact that their expensive educations and tailored suits had missed what a self-taught bookkeeper caught immediately. They walked into the conference room at 9 o'clock exactly. Every board member already seated. David's smile faded when he saw Daniel. Confusion flickered across his face, quickly replaced by contempt. Like Victoria bringing her boyfriend to a board meeting proved everything he'd been saying about her poor judgment. The chairman started to speak, began the formal process of calling Victoria to account, demanding her decision about whether she'd end the inappropriate relationship and refocus on Sterling Tech. Victoria cut him off, placed Daniel's folder on the conference table, told them calmly that before they discussed her personal life, they should probably address the felony their former partner had been committing for 2 years. The room went silent, David's face drained of color. He recovered fast, tried to bluster, called it absurd, said she was deflecting from her own failures. But his voice carried an edge of panic that everyone heard. Victoria walked around the table slowly, explained the shell companies, the payment patterns, the systematic theft of $2.7 million. Noted that Daniel Hayes, the janitor they dismissed as a distraction, had uncovered what none of their MBAs or law degrees had caught. A board member asked for proof. Victoria nodded to Daniel. He stood uncomfortable but steady, walked them through the spreadsheets. Page 3, Morrison Strategic Solutions, LLC, registered April 2022. Page 5, payments, always under $50,000. Page 7, wire transfers to David's personal account in the Cayman Islands. Page 12, emails David thought were deleted, recovered by Marcus Chen's team 20 minutes ago. David's face went from pale to red, stood abruptly, called the whole thing fabricated, accused Victoria of manufacturing evidence to deflect from her own incompetence. But his voice shook, his hands trembled. Everyone in the room heard the desperation. The chairman studied the documents, asked legal counsel to review them. After 5 minutes of tense silence, the former prosecutor on the board spoke. She'd seen enough securities fraud cases to recognize the real thing. This was legitimate. This was criminal. This was going to destroy David Morrison. Victoria leaned on the table, looked directly at David, told him he'd wanted her to choose between her company and her personal life, but she was choosing both, keeping the man she loved, taking back what David stole, filing criminal charges that day. Securities fraud carried 20 years. She'd make sure he served every one of them. David exploded, called her a bitch, said she'd regret this, that he'd fight her with everything he had, but the fight had already left his voice. He was a cornered animal, all bluster and no bite. Victoria's smile turned cold. Told him to fight. She'd win. She always won when the fight was fair. And this time she had someone fighting beside her who understood that worth wasn't measured in bank accounts. David stormed out, slammed the door hard enough to rattle the glass walls. Everyone sat in stunned silence. The chairman cleared his throat, offered an apology on behalf of the board. They'd let fear guide their decisions, had forgotten that Victoria built Sterling Tech on risk and vision, asked if she'd continue leading. On her own terms. Victoria looked at Daniel. He nodded once. Small gesture that said everything. I'm with you, whatever comes next. I'm with you. She turned back to the board, told them yes, she'd continue leading. Would file criminal charges against David that afternoon. Would petition the court to void his 49% since it was obtained through fraud. Would rebuild Sterling Tech stronger than before. And she'd do it with Daniel Hayes by her side. The board could accept that or replace her, their choice. No one moved to replace her. Several members actually smiled, relief evident on their faces. They'd gotten their ruthless CEO back. She'd just proven she could still fight, still win, still lead. The meeting adjourned. Victoria and Daniel walked out together. Sophie was waiting in the reception area coloring a picture. She looked up when they entered, asked with 7-year-old directness if everything was okay now. Daniel knelt beside his daughter, told her gently that yes, everything was okay, better than okay, because sometimes being brave meant fighting for what mattered instead of running away. And Victoria had just taught him that lesson. Sophie beamed, announced she was hungry. Could they get pancakes to celebrate? Daniel laughed, the first genuine laugh Victoria had heard from him in days. Said yes, they could absolutely get pancakes. They left Sterling Tech headquarters together, walked out into Chicago's sunshine. Reporters waited on the sidewalk, but Victoria ignored them. Kept walking, flanked by Daniel and Sophie. Let them see her choosing family over optics. Let them write whatever headlines they wanted. She had work to do, criminal charges to file, a company to rebuild, a life to live that included more than boardrooms and balance sheets. That evening, news broke about David Morrison's arrest, federal charges, securities fraud, embezzlement, wire fraud. The story dominated business news. How a billionaire CEO's working-class boyfriend had uncovered a massive fraud scheme. How the man dismissed as a gold digger had actually saved Sterling Tech. Public opinion shifted overnight. Comment sections filled with apologies. Think pieces about classism and assumptions. TikTok videos calling Daniel an American hero. Everyone suddenly loved the underdog story they'd been mocking 72 hours earlier. Daniel hated every second of the attention, told Victoria repeatedly that he just wanted to go back to being anonymous, to taking Sophie to school and working his jobs and having quiet Saturday mornings without cameras following them. But Victoria understood something he didn't yet. The attention would fade. Viral stories burned hot and died fast. In 2 weeks, the internet would find someone new to obsess over. What mattered was what came after the noise stopped, what kind of life they'd build when the cameras finally looked away. She asked him to move in. Not immediately, she understood that would be too much too fast. But eventually, when he was ready, when Sophie was ready, when it felt right instead of reactive, she wanted them in her life permanently. Wanted Saturday mornings to become every morning. Wanted to stop counting days between seeing them. Daniel said he'd think about it, needed to consider what was best for Sophie, what kind of disruption a move would cause, whether bringing his daughter into Victoria's world would help or hurt. All reasonable concerns, all grounded in the fierce protectiveness that made Victoria love him more. They had time to figure it out, time to let the dust settle, time to build something real instead of rushing into decisions made under pressure. For now, it was enough that they'd chosen each other, that they'd fought for this relationship instead of letting circumstance destroy it, that Daniel had proved himself not by becoming wealthy, but by being exactly who he was: skilled, principled, and brave enough to fight for what mattered. Victoria went home to her empty penthouse that night, but empty felt different now, temporary instead of permanent. A space waiting to be filled with life and laughter, and Sophie's drawings covering the refrigerator. She could be patient, could let Daniel move at his own pace, could prove through actions instead of words that she meant every promise she'd made. The future stretched out, uncertain but full of possibility. Legal battles waited, board meetings, the slow process of rebuilding Sterling Tech's reputation. But Victoria faced it all with something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Real, grounded hope that life could include both success and happiness. That she didn't have to sacrifice one to prove the other. That love mattered more than quarterly earnings and always had. She poured herself 2 fingers of scotch, stood at the window watching the city glitter below, thought about Saturday mornings and birthday cakes and small hands sticky with frosting, thought about Daniel's steady presence and Sophie's fierce love in building something that mattered more than money. The lawsuit papers arrived 3 weeks after David's arrest, hand-delivered by a process server who looked apologetic about ruining Victoria's morning. Marcus Sterling versus Victoria Sterling contesting the validity of their father's will. 10 years after Robert Sterling's death, 10 years after the estate had been settled. Now suddenly her brother wanted his share. Victoria read through the filing with hands that stayed steady through sheer force of will. Marcus claimed undue influence. Alleged she'd manipulated their father during his final illness. Painted a picture of Victoria as a scheming daughter who'd isolated Robert from his other children while he was vulnerable and dying. The language was careful, legal, devastating. Her brother was using Daniel. The filing referenced her recent relationship as evidence of impaired judgment, suggested a pattern of impulsive decisions and emotional instability. If she couldn't be trusted in her personal life, how could she have been trusted to care for a dying parent 10 years ago? The strategy was clear. Exploit her vulnerability. Use the very happiness she'd fought for as a weapon against her. Prove she was unstable now to argue she'd been unstable then. take everything because she dared to want something beyond money and power. Victoria called her attorney. Jennifer Wong had handled the original estate 10 years ago. She'd known Robert Sterling personally, had witnessed him revise his will while fully lucid and clear about his intentions. But 10 years was a long time. Memories faded, witnesses died. Cases that should have been settled could be reopened if someone had enough motivation and a good enough lawyer. Jennifer arrived at Victoria's office within the hour. Read through the filing with a lawyer's careful attention to detail. When she looked up, her expression was grim. Marcus had hired Alan Chen, one of Chicago's most aggressive litigators, the kind of attorney who won cases through sheer brutality, who made witnesses cry on the stand and juries doubt everything they thought they knew. This wasn't going to be a simple dismissal. This was going to be war, depositions and discovery, and months of legal maneuvering. And at the center of it all would be Victoria's relationship with Daniel, the thing that made her happy, used as proof that she couldn't be trusted. The deposition took place in a conference room that smelled like old carpet and recycled air. Marcus sat across the table looking self-righteous and aggrieved. His attorney Chen started gentle establishing timeline and basic facts. Then he went for the throat. Questions about her mental state after losing half her company. Questions about starting a relationship during what she herself had described as the worst period of her life. Questions designed to make her sound desperate, unstable, incapable of rational thought. Each question carefully phrased to avoid objections while still implying she was falling apart. Victoria kept her voice level, answered truthfully without volunteering information. Yes, she'd gone through difficulties. Yes, she'd begun a relationship during that time. No, she didn't believe her judgment was impaired. She'd found someone genuine after years of being surrounded by people who wanted to use her. That wasn't instability. That was clarity. But Chen twisted her words, made connection sound like dependency, made happiness sound like desperation, made falling in love sound like a mental health crisis. 4 hours of careful verbal surgery cutting away context until only damaging sound bites remained. When Victoria left the deposition, she found Daniel waiting in the parking garage. He'd rearranged his work schedule to be there. Couldn't attend the deposition itself, but wanted her to know she didn't face this alone. The gesture meant more than he probably understood. She collapsed into his arms, let herself be weak for 30 seconds, then pulled herself together and told him everything. How Chen had used their relationship as ammunition. How every question had been designed to make her sound unstable. How her brother was trying to take everything because she dared to choose happiness over isolation. Daniel's jaw tightened. He asked quietly if there was anything he could do, anything that might help. Victoria shook her head. This was a legal battle. Money and attorneys and arguments in courtrooms. What could a janitor who worked 3 jobs possibly offer that her team of lawyers couldn't provide better? But Daniel's expression said he was thinking about something, working through an idea he wasn't quite ready to share. Victoria was too exhausted to press. Let him drive her home. Let him make her tea and sit with her while she stared at nothing. Let him be the steady presence that kept her from drowning. 3 days later, Jennifer called with bad news. Chen was building a compelling narrative. Victoria's recent behavior, the public relationship, the David Morrison scandal, the board crisis, all painted a picture of someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted. If juries believed she made poor decisions, now they might believe she'd manipulated her dying father 10 years ago. They needed character witnesses, people who could testify that Victoria was stable, rational, trustworthy. Jennifer started listing options. Business associates, former employees, anyone who'd known her long enough to speak to her character. Victoria went through the list and found it depressingly short. Business associates had agendas. Former employees had grievances or debts. Everyone in her professional life came with complications. She'd built an empire but hadn't built a support system, hadn't built real relationships that could withstand scrutiny, except one. She had Daniel and Sophie and Saturday mornings that had saved her when she didn't know she needed saving. But how could she ask Daniel to testify Chen would eviscerate him, make him defend his poverty and his jobs and his relationship with a woman whose watch cost more than he made in a year? She couldn't put him through that. That evening, Daniel came to her penthouse after Sophie was in bed. A neighbor was watching his daughter. He'd asked for this time specifically, needed to talk about something important. He told her he wanted to testify, wanted to stand up in court and tell the truth about who Victoria really was. Not the billionaire or the CEO or the woman in Forbes magazine. The person underneath all that. The woman who'd shared her birthday cake with strangers. Who'd listened to a 7-year-old chatter about dragons. Who'd fought for their relationship when walking away would have been easier. Victoria tried to refuse. Explained what Chen would do. The questions about money and motivation. The implications that Daniel was using her. The brutal cross-examination designed to make him look like a gold digger in front of a courtroom full of strangers. She couldn't ask him to endure that. But Daniel's voice stayed steady, told her he wasn't asking permission. He was informing her of his decision. Because running away hadn't worked. Hiding hadn't worked. The only thing that worked was standing up and fighting for what mattered. She taught him that. Now it was his turn to fight for her. Victoria felt tears burn behind her eyes. This man who had every reason to walk away was choosing to stand beside her. Choosing to expose himself to judgment and cruelty because he believed she was worth defending. She didn't know if she deserved that kind of loyalty, but she was grateful beyond words that he offered it anyway. Jennifer agreed to call Daniel as a character witness. Spent the next 2 weeks preparing him. Mock cross-examinations in her office, practicing staying calm under hostile questioning, learning to answer directly without getting defensive, teaching him that the truth delivered with quiet dignity could be more powerful than any legal maneuvering. Victoria watched the practice sessions and saw Daniel transform, not into someone different, into a clearer version of himself, someone who'd stopped apologizing for who he was, who'd stopped letting other people's opinions define his worth, who'd learned that being poor didn't make him less valuable, just less wealthy. And there was a difference. The trial started on a Monday in late summer, Cook County Circuit Court. Judge Patricia Morrison presiding, no relation to David mercifully. Marcus sat with his attorney at the plaintiff's table. Victoria sat with Jennifer at the defense table. Daniel sat in the gallery behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence, far enough that decorum was maintained. Chen's opening statement painted Victoria as a master manipulator. Someone who'd isolated her father, convinced him to disinvest his other children, and secured everything for herself. Someone whose recent behavior, the failed engagement at the company crisis, the inappropriate relationship, demonstrated a lifelong pattern of poor judgment and emotional instability. Jennifer's opening countered with facts. Robert Sterling had revised his will while fully competent. Multiple doctors would testify to his mental clarity. He'd left everything to Victoria because she'd earned it, had worked alongside him for 15 years, while her siblings only called when they needed money. The will reflected reality, not manipulation. The first week consisted of Marcus's witnesses. His wife testified that Marcus had tried repeatedly to visit their father, but Victoria had blocked him. Hospital records proved otherwise. Marcus visited once in 8 weeks. Victoria visited daily. Their sister Jennifer took the stand reluctantly, testified that she'd felt excluded from their father's final weeks, but under cross-examination admitted she'd been planning her second wedding during that time, had been more concerned with venue selection than hospital visits. Marcus himself testified on day 4, claimed he'd been close to their father, that Robert had loved all his children equally, that Victoria had somehow poisoned his mind during the final illness. Chen let him talk, building sympathy. Painting Marcus as the grieving son denied his rightful inheritance. Jennifer's cross-examination was surgical. Phone records showing Marcus called his father twice in the 8 weeks before death. Victoria called daily. Hospital sign-in sheets showing Marcus visited once. Victoria was there every day for 2 months. LinkedIn profile proving Marcus was unemployed at the time, plenty of availability to visit if he'd cared to. Bank records showing Marcus had borrowed $50,000 from Robert 6 months before his death. Never repaid, then requested another $30,000 2 months before Robert died. Request denied. Will revised 1 month later. Timeline suggested Robert had finally seen his son clearly. By the end of week 1, Chen's narrative was crumbling. But he still had Victoria's recent behavior to exploit. Week 2 would focus on her instability, her poor judgment, her emotional volatility, her relationship with a man whose annual income couldn't cover her monthly car payment. Victoria testified on Monday of week 2. Jennifer guided her through direct examination, establishing her relationship with her father. The years working together. His clear-minded decision to leave Sterling Tech to the child who'd helped build it. His explicit statements that his other children had chosen not to participate in the family business, that he loved them but wouldn't reward inaction. Then Chen took over for cross-examination, started gentle establishing Victoria's success, her wealth, her power, making sure the jury understood just how much was at stake. Then he pivoted to her recent difficulties, the David Morrison betrayal, the loss of half her company, the failed engagement. Each point delivered like a blow. Questions about her emotional state during that period, whether she'd considered therapy, whether she'd felt depressed, anxious, overwhelmed. Victoria answered honestly, yes, she'd been struggling. But struggling wasn't the same as being unstable. Everyone faced difficulties. How you handled them mattered more than whether they occurred. Chen pressed harder, asked about Daniel, about beginning a relationship during what she just admitted was a difficult period. Whether that suggested she was seeking comfort rather than connection, whether she was making rational decisions or emotional ones. Victoria met his eyes, told him that falling in love with Daniel was the most rational decision she'd made in years, that he'd saved her by reminding her what actually mattered, that choosing happiness over isolation wasn't instability, it was sanity. But Chen kept twisting, kept making love sound like dependency, kept suggesting that someone who made such questionable romantic choices might have made questionable decisions about her father's care. By the time Jennifer redirected, the damage was done. The jury looked uncertain, questioning. Wednesday morning, Jennifer called Daniel to the stand. He wore his best clothes, khakis, and a button-down shirt Victoria had helped him pick out. Nothing fancy, nothing that pretended to be something he wasn't. Just a working man who'd cleaned up for court. Jennifer started with background. His marriage to Rebecca, her death, raising Sophie alone while working 3 jobs, the financial struggles, the bankruptcy, all laid out honestly, no attempt to hide or minimize, just facts delivered plainly. Then she asked about meeting Victoria. Daniel described the coffee shop, Sophie approaching a sad woman on her birthday, how Victoria had looked so lost that even a child could see it, how they'd shared cake and conversation, how friendship had grown slowly into something more. Jennifer asked what he saw in Victoria, what made her special beyond her wealth. Daniel's answer came without hesitation. She was kind, genuinely kind. Not the performative charity of the wealthy, but actual concern for others. She listened like people's words mattered. She laughed at Sophie's jokes. She made him feel like maybe he wasn't drowning after all. And Victoria, what did she bring to his life beyond financial security? Daniel smiled slightly, said she brought nothing financial. She'd tried once to fix his car, and he'd nearly ended things because of it. She'd learned that he needed to take care of himself and his daughter, that accepting help didn't mean surrendering dignity. What she brought was connection, someone to talk to who understood loneliness, someone who made Saturday mornings feel like holidays, someone who loved his daughter genuinely, not as a means to access him, someone who'd fought for their relationship when walking away would have been easier. Jennifer established that Victoria had never given him money, never paid his rent or his bills, never tried to buy his affection or dependence. Their relationship was built on conversation and shared experience, on finding each other during hard times and choosing to face those times together. Then Chen stood for cross-examination. The courtroom got quieter, everyone sensing the attack about to come. He started with employment, made Daniel list his 3 jobs, the hourly wages, the annual income. Let those numbers hang in the air. $52,000 a year gross. After taxes, maybe $40,000. Supporting himself and a child in Chicago on that amount. Then Chen asked about Victoria's net worth. Daniel admitted he didn't know exactly. Chen supplied the figure. $1.2 billion. Let the jury do the math. Ratio of 1 to 30,000. 2 different universes. No common ground except the physical space they occupied. Chen asked if Daniel had received anything from Victoria. Gifts, payments, assistance of any kind. Daniel thought about the car repair, admitted it, explained he'd paid her back. Chen pressed how much did the repair cost? $800. How much had Daniel repaid? $200 before Victoria stopped accepting payments. So he still owed her $600. Still in her debt. Still dependent on her charity, whether he wanted to admit it or not. Chen made it sound sordid, transactional. Like their entire relationship was built on financial imbalance. Daniel's jaw tightened, told Chen carefully that Victoria had refused further payment, that he'd wanted to pay in full, that she'd stopped him because making his point mattered more than the money. Chen smiled, suggested that was easy for a billionaire. $600 meant nothing to her, meant everything to Daniel. Another reminder of the imbalance between them. The questioning got more personal, more cruel. Chen asked about Daniel's late wife, about medical debt, about bankruptcy, making Daniel relive the worst moments of his life in front of strangers, implying that a man who'd failed so completely couldn't be trusted to evaluate another person's character. Then Chen went for the kill, asked about Sophie seeing the negative comments online, about his daughter learning the word gold digger, about a 7-year-old having to defend her father's integrity to schoolmates. Wasn't it true that his relationship with Victoria had harmed his child? That he'd put his own desires above his daughter's well-being? Daniel's face went pale. He gripped the witness stand. When he spoke, his voice shook slightly. Admitted that yes, Sophie had been hurt. That he'd never wanted that. That watching his daughter cry because of internet cruelty had nearly broken him. But then his voice steadied. He looked directly at Chen, said that Sophie had also gained something. She'd gained Victoria, a woman who loved his daughter genuinely, who taught her about stars and science, who showed up when it mattered. Sophie had 2 parents now instead of 1. A mother figure who chose to be there rather than being obligated by biology. Was that worth some temporary pain from strangers? Daniel thought so. Sophie thought so. They were building a family. Real families endured difficulties. They didn't run at the first sign of trouble. Victoria had taught him that. And he was grateful for the lesson. Chen tried to push harder, suggested Daniel was fooling himself, that this relationship would end when Victoria got bored, that he'd be left with nothing while she moved on to the next novelty, that he was using his daughter's need for a mother to justify his own dependence. Daniel's response came quiet but firm. Told Chen that maybe he was right, maybe this would end badly, maybe Victoria would wake up one day and realize she could do better. But until that happened, he'd love her with everything he had, would stand beside her through legal battles and public scrutiny, would prove that his worth wasn't measured by bank accounts, that poor men could be good men, that working 3 jobs to support your child was something to be proud of, not ashamed of. Chen opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Morrison intervened, told him he'd made his point. Time to move on. Chen tried one more attack. Asked Daniel directly, what could someone like him possibly offer someone like Victoria Sterling? Daniel looked at Victoria sitting at the defense table, met her eyes, held her gaze while the courtroom waited. Then he turned back to Chen. His answer was simple, honest, devastating in its truth. He offered himself, his loyalty, his time, his attention, his presence during 3 a.m. panic attacks and board meeting crises, his daughter's laughter and crayon drawings. Saturday mornings that felt sacred. Someone who saw her as Victoria instead of as a billionaire. Someone who loved her not despite her success but alongside it. Someone who would fight for her when everyone else told him to walk away. Money couldn't buy those things. Status couldn't purchase them. They only came when someone chose to give them freely. And he'd chosen Victoria. Would keep choosing her. Every day. For as long as she'd have him. The courtroom went silent. Even Chen looked uncertain. Judge Morrison calls for a brief recess. The jury filed out. Daniel stepped down from the witness stand, walked directly to Victoria. She stood, threw her arms around him, didn't care about decorum or propriety or what anyone thought, just held him while he just exposed his heart to strangers for her sake. When court reconvened, Jennifer called her final witnesses. Robert Sterling's doctors testified he had been clear-minded and decisive even weeks before his death. His attorney confirmed the will revision had been Robert's idea, not Victoria's. Several former Sterling tech employees spoke about Victoria's work ethic and integrity, about how she'd earned everything she had through relentless effort and vision. But Daniel's testimony echoed louder than any of it. The jury had seen a man strip himself bare, had watched him defend Victoria not with wealth or status, but with simple truth, had heard him explain that worth came from character, not cash. That love meant more than financial compatibility. That family was built through choice, not convenience. Closing arguments happened on Thursday. Chen tried to recover, argued that Daniel's testimony proved Victoria's judgment was impaired, that she was so desperate for connection she'd latched onto the first kind person she'd met. That emotional vulnerability 10 years ago could have led to the same kind of impulsive decisions during her father's illness. Jennifer countered with facts, hospital records, doctor testimony, timeline proving Victoria had been present and engaged. Marcus had been absent and self-interested. The will reflected reality. Victoria had earned her inheritance. Marcus was trying to exploit his sister's happiness to steal what he'd never worked for. Judge Morrison took the case under advisement, said she'd issue a ruling within a week. Court adjourned. Victoria and Daniel left together. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. They ignored everything. Walked to Victoria's car hand in hand. Drove away while the media circus continued without them. The ruling came 6 days later. Judge Morrison issued a detailed opinion. Found no evidence of undue influence. Extensive documentation proved Robert Sterling had been competent and clear-minded. His decision to leave Sterling Tech to Victoria reflected years of observation. She'd earned it, Marcus hadn't. As for Victoria's recent relationship, the judge's opinion was pointed. Finding happiness didn't equal instability. Making unconventional choices didn't suggest impaired judgment. If anything, Victoria's willingness to pursue a relationship despite public scrutiny showed strength of character. The case was dismissed. The will stood. Marcus Sterling would receive nothing. Victoria read the ruling 3 times, let relief wash through her in waves. It was over. The lawsuit, the scrutiny, the attempt to use her happiness as a weapon. Over. She'd won. More importantly, she'd won without sacrificing what mattered, without giving up Daniel or pretending their relationship was anything other than what it was, real and messy and worth fighting for. That evening, she met Daniel and Sophie at their coffee shop. Riverside Coffee corner table, 3 cups of hot chocolate instead of regular coffee. Celebrating. Sophie drew a picture of them, 3 stick figures holding hands, her family, complete and perfect in a 7-year-old's eyes. Daniel asked if she wanted to take a walk, just the 2 of them. Sophie could stay with the barista who'd watched her before. Victoria agreed. They left Sophie happily coloring and stepped out into September evening. Chicago autumn starting to bite, leaves turning, days getting shorter. They walked to the Riverwalk, the spot where he'd first told her he saw her, where everything had shifted from friendship to something more. Daniel stopped at the exact location, turned to face her, took both her hands. His voice shook slightly when he spoke, told her he'd been thinking about what the judge wrote, about strength of character, about fighting for what mattered, about building a life that included more than just survival. He'd spent 5 years existing instead of living, working himself to exhaustion, providing for Sophie, but forgetting to show her what happiness looked like. Then Victoria had stumbled into their lives, sad and lonely and impossibly wealthy, and she taught him that being vulnerable wasn't weakness, that asking for help didn't diminish dignity, that love was worth the risk of heartbreak. He pulled a small box from his jacket pocket, not Tiffany's, a local jeweler. Simple gold band with a small diamond. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that pretended to compete with her wealth, just honest and real, and offered with shaking hands. Daniel knelt on the Riverwalk, told her she'd saved his life, saved Sophie's life, made them believe in possibilities beyond just getting through another day. He didn't have money, didn't have status, couldn't offer her anything the world valued, but he had love, had loyalty, had a daughter who adored her, had Saturday mornings and shared laughter and the promise to stand beside her through whatever came next. Would she marry him? Build a family with him and Sophie? Take a chance on a future that included more than boardrooms and balance sheets? Choose happiness over convention one more time. Victoria's throat closed. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She pulled him to his feet, told him yes, obviously yes. How could she say anything else? He was the best man she'd ever known, the bravest, the most honest. He'd fought for her when everyone else told him to walk away, had exposed himself to judgment and cruelty because he believed she was worth defending. Daniel slid the ring onto her finger. Perfect fit. He'd asked Jennifer about her size, had consulted with Sophie about the design, had spent 3 weeks' worth of grocery money on a symbol that meant more than any 10-carat diamond could. A promise, a commitment, a choice to build something together. They kissed on the riverwalk while joggers passed and boats moved on the river below, lost in each other, in the impossible improbability of finding love when both had given up looking, in the stubborn refusal to let circumstances dictate happiness, in the recognition that wealth came in forms beyond currency. That richness meant connection and laughter in Saturday mornings. That family was built through choice and commitment and showing up when it mattered. 1 year later, Victoria stood on the beach at her lake house in Michigan, Labor Day weekend, the house she'd owned for years without visiting, 3 hours from Chicago, private waterfront, Sophie building sandcastles with cousins Jennifer's kids, the sisterhood reconciled after the trial, Daniel and his father grilling hamburgers on the deck, Karen from Victoria's office playing frisbee with her partner. This house had sat empty for so long, a symbol of success she never enjoyed. Now it rang with laughter and life, filled with people she'd chosen, family built through intention rather than obligation. Sophie called her mom now. The transition had happened gradually. No announcement or ceremony. Just a small voice saying it one morning, and Victoria's heart expanding to accommodate joy she hadn't known existed. They'd married 6 months ago. Small ceremony at the courthouse where Daniel and Rebecca had wed. Circle of life completing itself. 50 guests, immediate family, and actual friends. Sophie as flower girl wearing a dress Victoria had let her pick out herself, purple with sparkles. Perfect. Daniel still worked, not 3 jobs anymore. He'd taken a position as chief financial officer for a nonprofit helping working families, using his accounting skills, making $40,000 a year, less than he'd made combining 3 jobs but with benefits and normal hours. Time with Sophie. Time with Victoria. Time to live instead of just survive. Victoria had started the foundation, the Rebecca Hayes Foundation, scholarships and childcare assistance for single parents, job training, financial literacy, everything Daniel had needed and couldn't find, making sure other families didn't have to struggle the way he had, using her wealth for something that actually mattered. Sterling Tech was thriving. David Morrison was serving 12 years in federal prison. Victoria had bought back his 49% from the court-appointed receiver, owned it 98% now, 2% public float to maintain the stock listing. Complete control. But she worked 60 hours a week instead of 90. Left the office by 6. Had family dinners. Built a life beyond her career. Sophie ran up from the beach, covered in sand, asking if they could have s'mores tonight. Daniel said yes before Victoria could answer. Father and daughter exchanging a smile that included her now. Making decisions together. Navigating parenthood as a team. Victoria had never imagined herself as a mother. Now she couldn't imagine anything else. That night after Sophie had fallen asleep, sticky with marshmallow residue, Victoria and Daniel walked the beach alone. Stars overhead, Lake Michigan gentle against the shore. A year since everything had nearly fallen apart. Since they'd almost let fear win. Since they'd chosen to fight instead of run. Daniel asked if she ever regretted it. Choosing him over easier options. Taking the hard path. Fighting battles that could have been avoided by selecting someone from her own world. Victoria stopped walking, turned to face him, moonlight silver on the water behind him. Told him the truth, that she regretted every day she'd wasted not looking for this. Every hour spent building an empire while ignoring her heart. Every moment before Sophie had asked if she was okay, and Danielle had offered cake and awkward conversation, and the promise that maybe loneliness wasn't permanent. She'd lost half a company and gained a whole life. Lost the illusion of control and gained actual happiness. Lost the approval of people who didn't matter and gained the love of people who did. Worth it. 1,000 times worth it. She'd make the same choice every day for the rest of her life. Daniel pulled her close, kissed her while waves lapped at their feet, told her quietly that he loved her, would love her forever, would keep choosing her every morning, keep fighting for this family they'd built, keep proving that worth wasn't measured in bank accounts, that success meant love and laughter and Saturday mornings. That richness came from connection. That family was everything. They stood together on the beach while the house glowed behind them. Filled with people and noise and life, Sophie's drawing on the refrigerator, three stick figures holding hands now a reality instead of a wish. This makeshift family that shouldn't have worked, that defied conventional wisdom, that existed because two lonely people had been brave enough to be vulnerable, brave enough to choose happiness over isolation, brave enough to believe that love mattered more than money and always would. Victoria looked at the man beside her, working-class father who'd become her husband, janitor turned CFO who'd saved her company by noticing what everyone else missed, partner who'd stood beside her when standing alone would have been easier, father to the daughter who'd become hers too. Everything she'd never known she needed, wrapped up in worn jeans and quiet strength. She'd been the loneliest woman in Chicago, sitting in a coffee shop with a birthday cake no one would help her blow out, surrounded by wealth that meant nothing, success that felt empty, life measured in quarterly earnings instead of actual living. Now she had Saturday mornings, had family dinners, had Sophie's soccer games and parent-teacher conferences, had Daniel's steady presence and terrible jokes, had love that cost nothing and meant everything, had learned that true wealth wasn't counted in bank accounts, that the richest people were the ones who had someone to come home to, someone who saw them, someone who stayed. The coffee shop where it had all begun was still their Saturday morning ritual. Same corner table, same orders. Sophie older now, but still coloring dragons. Daniel still protesting when Victoria reached for the check. Still paying his share with bills carefully counted. Still proving every week that his dignity mattered as much as her billions. People recognized them sometimes. The billionaire and the janitor who'd beaten the odds, who'd proved that love could transcend economics, who'd built a family from broken pieces and made it beautiful. But mostly people just saw what they were, a family. Ordinary and extraordinary, struggling with homework and bills and making time for each other. Living the kind of life that actually mattered. Victoria had learned that you couldn't buy the things that filled empty spaces, couldn't purchase belonging or connection, or someone asking if you were okay and genuinely caring about the answer. Those things only came when you were brave enough to be vulnerable, wise enough to recognize value that balance sheets couldn't measure, stubborn enough to fight for happiness when the world said it was impossible. She'd spent 40 years building the wrong empire, accumulating wealth while losing herself, becoming successful at everything except living. Then a 7-year-old with sticky fingers and an enormous heart had asked one simple question: "Are you okay?" And everything had changed. All because Victoria had been honest enough to admit she wasn't, brave enough to accept kindness from strangers, open enough to let them become family. The future stretched ahead, uncertain and full of possibility. Sophie's college years, Daniel's career growth, the foundation expanding. More families helped, more Saturday mornings, more anniversaries and birthdays and ordinary moments that added up to extraordinary lives. More proof that choosing love over convenience was always the right answer. That wealth meant nothing without someone to share it with. That family, real family, chosen family was everything. Victoria Sterling had been the loneliest woman in Chicago. Now she stood on a beach surrounded by laughter and love, holding the hand of a man who taught her that worth came from character. That success meant happiness. That richness was measured in connections, not currency. That family was built through choice and showing up and loving each other through difficulty. She'd gained everything by giving up the illusion that money mattered most. Had learned that being vulnerable wasn't weakness, that accepting help didn't diminish dignity, that love was worth fighting for even when fighting seemed impossible, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was admit you needed someone, and that the person who saved you might be someone you never expected. Might be someone the world said you shouldn't want, might be someone whose wealth was measured in an entirely different currency, might be exactly the person you'd been searching for without knowing you were searching at all.